And he said, "Are you available to travel to Eilat to interview some of the evacuees with our cameraman?" And I was like, "Yes, definitely." And I went down there and I thought we were going to be fighting like the media, to get into these hotels and to talk to these survivors. And it turns out we were the only media there. And we were the first ones that these people were telling their stories to. They were still shaking.
Welcome to What Came After. I'm your host, Manya Marcus. On What Came After, we'll take a look at the many ways that people's lives changed on and after the brutal massacre in Israel on October 7th, 2023. We'll be speaking with people in Israel and around the world about how the devastating attack by Hamas has shifted, shaped, and changed them. To learn more about our podcast, please visit us at whatcameafter.com. Hi, Nicole. I'm so happy that you made it in. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
I want to start by asking you to introduce yourself. Where are you from? How did you get to Israel? What do you do for work? And also, if you could tell us a little bit about your religious affiliation, I think that would be interesting.
Sure. So I was born and raised in New York. And long story short, at some point, I just decided I wanted to live in Israel. And I Googled reporter job Jerusalem because I was a reporter at the time. And I thought, if there's any place to be for news that's going to always be in the headlines, it's Israel. It was just after 9/11, and Iraq was in the news, and then Afghanistan. And I do have an interest in war correspondence as a reporter. I knew that those wars were going to be temporary. There will be a couple years and then they would be over. But I knew somewhere deep down, even at that age, even though I hadn't lived here, I said, Jerusalem will always be in the headlines. So I Googled this, and the first thing that popped up was the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, by the way, is looking for a reporter for its Jerusalem office. So I was like, all right, well, I'm a reporter and I'm Christian and I want to live in Jerusalem. So that should work out. And I researched it a little bit more and found out that it's an organization that does humanitarian charitable aid, support of Israel advocacy, stuff like that. And I was like, okay, let me try it out. What's the worst that could happen? So I sent a letter and a resume right away. I shut my computer down because that's what you did back then. Because, by the way, this was 20 plus years ago. And then I started packing my apartment. I was like, that's it. I'm leaving. I know I'm going to go live in Israel. Like that, I just knew it for some reason. And they didn't get back to me right away, which kind of scared me a little bit. I was like, oh, I'm going to have to start unpacking my winter clothes now. But sure enough, they got back to me and it was fine. It was a go. So 2 days after Christmas, I had a one-way ticket to Jerusalem. And that's that. I've lived here since the end of 2001.
Wow. Had you been to Israel prior to your decision to move to Jerusalem?
Only 2 weeks before, actually. My first trip was booked for September, end of September 2001. Now, on September 11, 2001 was, the 9/11 attacks, and I lived in New York at the time. So my first thing was I was really concerned that my flight was going to be canceled. And it wasn't, and we did make the trip, and I felt it was all the more significant because at the same time, it was the Intifada, the second Intifada in Israel. So I was like, okay, I'm going from one terror zone to another, and I have a little bit more understanding and empathy for what's happening. So that was my first trip, and it was really at that time where I was like, yeah, I could live here. Like, I want to live here. And in fact, I was actually using a payphone to call the Jerusalem Post at the time saying, how can I apply for a job? But of course, it wasn't going to happen. And also not really understanding at the time, you can't just go live in another country. You have to have a visa. You have to have the ability to. And of course, I would have never been able to move to Israel if it wasn't for getting, at the time, it was a volunteer visa, because the only way to move here and become a citizen is you have to be Jewish and make Aliyah. So I didn't realize that at the time, but I did get this volunteer visa. And well, within the first year, I met a guy and he happens to live here. He was at the time only a resident, not a citizen, but he was born and raised here. in Jerusalem. And he's also a Christian and Armenian from the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. So anyway, we dated for a couple years and got married. And actually, everybody thought he was marrying me for the American passport, but we haven't left. So
Are you suggesting that you married him for his eventual citizenship? I think we've
it's
just
like,
broken a news story.
right? It's like just like a little backwards, right? But
I think as a reporter, reporters have something in common with therapists because at times I refer to myself, when I'm very cynical, as an emotional ambulance chaser, right? To go
yes.
after the story, you really have to follow the pain.
Yep.
It seems like you were really prescient because Jerusalem has never not been in the news. When there's peacetime in Israel, we're just waiting,
Hmm.
right? Do you think the drive was primarily to be somewhere that just felt so critical to world events, or was it also a religious draw to be here?
Well, that's a great question. So, believing as I do that God does call people, He has something for you and for me, and it's different. So, I don't know whether it was biblical because it's Israel and Jerusalem. And I mean, if you look all throughout the Bible, it's all about Jerusalem, and in those days, Jerusalem will be a pot of reeling. That's my favorite verse, by
Oh,
the
a
way,
pot of.
of reeling. I think it's in Jeremiah, and it's in different translations, but to me, it just that specific translation just cracks me up because I'm like, yeah, I'm reeling every day from the traffic and
It is a
from
pot
the
of reeling.
tension. It
Yes.
is. It's probably, yeah, you've got to look it up in a different translation. But anyway, that just cracks me up because I do feel like that is Jerusalem. And so, was it an overall overarching biblical spiritual drive of what I believe that it's all about Jerusalem, right? Biblically, or was it that God wanted me specifically to be here and maybe in the course of my life will also want to go live somewhere else or feel like I should be living like in Armenia or something like that? I don't know, but in any case, it's where I'm supposed to be.
So you are a minority here. Christians must represent a pretty significant minority in Israel. Is that right?
About 2%.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
You and I met actually at a birthday party for a mutual friend who is a contributor to the Times of Israel. And I have to say that I assumed you were Jewish. And when you shared with me that you are not, I had a lot of questions, especially because you're an American. There are certainly non Jews who have been raised here for
Right.
generations. We all know this. But your story as an immigrant here and a non Aliyah story was really compelling to me. As a reporter, it sounds like you primarily cover issues of religious minorities within Israel, although certainly since the war, the scope seems to have widened. Can you tell us what kind of stories you were covering before October 7th? And then we can look after October 7th, how things
Hmm.
have changed?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from the beginning, I cover all aspects of Israeli politics, of Israel, of in the beginning, especially terror attacks. I was at a lot of them. I can walk down the streets in my neighborhood now and be like, oh, yeah, that was where this bus blew up right here. And this was Cafe Hillel. It's no longer there, but there was an attack there. I used to go drink coffee there all the time. So that was one thing for a while, and I cover the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the last couple years, I have also been focusing on minority groups here, like the Christians, and just to even explain, because the background that I come from as a Christian, as a Western Christian, is so different from the Eastern Christians and their beliefs. And for being such a small minority, I mean, 2%, which is about less than 200,000 people in Israel. And by the way, only 1% of Palestinians are Christian. And, Bethlehem is Palestinian, and that's where Jesus was born, right? So there's so few Christians here. But despite that, among the Christians, there are so many denominations. There's Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Catholic, there's the Latins, there's Syriac, there is Aramaean, there's Maronite. I mean, I've never heard of many of these. And I was just curious. I think a lot of being a reporter is just I'm curious and I just want to know. And so I ask the questions. It's been an interesting journey to bridge that gap from Western Christianity to Eastern Christianity, which is different theologically, but it's also just different culturally. And I do find the cultures fascinating and the traditions. And I do have to say, being a minority now, which I never really looked at it that way, because I don't feel marginalized or too different. I mean, like you said, where we met, I was just sitting at a table with a bunch of friends, and you don't feel so different, like maybe on the weekend, on Shabbat, let's say, or on the holidays when you don't have anything like the rest of the country. You probably feel that way as a Jew living in America on Christmas. But other than that, it's just been interesting looking at a minority group and being a part of a minority group and seeing from the inside out. So it's been an interesting experience, I have to say.
What is it like for you to live on the Jewish calendar? I don't know if you knew about all of our holidays, which we are now
I
looking at
did not.
an entire month of holidays.
Yeah.
Coming here, did you understand that you were going to be living, you don't have to be Jewish, but you're on the Jewish calendar here?
Hmm. Yeah. And I think the full impact of the Jewish holidays did not hit me until I had kids in Israeli schools who just got off from 2 months of summer vacation, had 2 days of school, and then they had more or less another month off from school. And I kind of lost my mind. I mean, God bless, but the Jewish holidays are on the Jewish calendar, but the education system is on the Western calendar. And the twain don't work together. So never the twain shall meet. I don't know. They just don't work together. So just to also complicate things, my children go to an Israeli school that is called Hand in Hand. And it is partially public school, partially sponsored by an organization that brings together Jews and Arabs, Palestinians, and also the religions, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. And these kids learn together and they learn in two different languages. It's a bilingual school. They learn in Hebrew and Arabic. And then, out of respect, they have off all the holidays as well. So, not only have I been swamped by the Jewish holidays, but we will have off a couple days for the end of Ramadan, for the iftar, the feast at the Eid at the end. And then we will have also Christmas. Orthodox Christians have off on January 7th, and you have the Western Christians who want to have off on December 25th. So, yeah, there's a lot of days off. And it's not more than a regular public school, but it is more chaotic.
I'm a mom.
Mm.
I
Mhm.
have
Feel my
3 young
pain?
kids, and, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's a logistical hurdle
Yeah.
I hadn't considered when I think about interfaith
Mm.
schooling.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So before we jump to October 7th, I would like to ask you a little bit to speak on your husband's behalf. What has his experience been like as an Armenian Christian, born and raised here, living in that quarter, also a minority?
Yeah. The Armenians are minority of minorities. There are maybe, I mean, it's really hard to pin down a number, but let's say about 6,000 Armenians in all of Israel. I don't know if that also includes the Palestinian territories. In the old city, maybe there's 2,000, maybe 1,000. I'm not sure. They have a quarter. They have a history since after the year 301, when Armenia became the first country to declare Christianity its national religion. Armenians started making pilgrimages to Jerusalem to learn more about their faith and to worship here in Jerusalem. And that's how the Armenian quarter got its start. So they have this rich history. Also, the country of Armenia has a rich history. It's amazing. But they live here, and it's very interesting. The Armenians really balance between both sides, especially here in Jerusalem. The more minority you are in this country, the more languages you speak. So if you're Israeli, you're not in the minority, you're the majority. So you speak Hebrew, and you probably also speak English. And then if you're an Arab or Palestinian, you also speak Arabic. So you speak Hebrew because you've got to get around here. You probably speak English because most people do, and then you also speak Arabic. So the Armenians also have Armenian, and it's a mother tongue to them. That's their first language in the Armenian community is Armenian. And so they also speak Hebrew, Arabic, and English. They really balance both sides. They live among the Palestinians, they live among the Israelis, and they just keep their head down and they just work and raise their families and integrate, but they maintain their own community. And I think that's the interesting thing is they do maintain their own community and their own school and everything. So that's how the culture has survived, or their presence has lasted so long here. But yeah, so he experienced, and the Armenians do experience a little bit of discrimination from both sides. The Israelis think they're Arabs, the Arabs think they're Israelis, and it's a bit more to navigate, but they've done it. They've managed to do it, and they managed to survive the Muslim conquest of the city and the Ottoman period, and now in the Jewish state. So they managed to hold that tension of both sides and continue to survive.
So that's really also what you do in your reporting. You hold a lot of tension, not just from both sides. I think there are really multiple angles of the conflict of life here. What was October 7th like for you and your family?
Wow, that's like one day it's like that you won't forget it. It's like you won't forget where you were on September 11th, and then you won't forget October 7th. I remember waking up, yeah, maybe 6, 7 o'clock. I'm not an observant Jew, so my phone was on, and I picked up my phone at 6:30, I think, and I saw the headline, "Azakot ba'adom," sirens in the South, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess, a couple rockets this morning for the holiday," whatever, put my phone back down, and then an hour and a half later, I woke up to sirens in Jerusalem, and knowing that there were sirens in the South, and now an hour and a half later getting sirens in Jerusalem, I was like, something's up. So we got our kids out, ran into the hallway, and we didn't go down to the bomb shelter because, you get the one siren, you don't think things are going to happen. But the sirens continued, and you're like, all right, something's up. At the time, I just remember the news alerts starting to buzz in, like, possible infiltration. And then the death tolls, 10 people dead. And you're like, wow, that's like a serious terror attack. And then 40. And then by the end of the day, it was like at 100 or 200. And you're like, this is by far the worst terror attack ever in Israel. And and not knowing that what we were going to be looking at was not a terror attack. It was actually an armed invasion and a slaughter and pre-planned and everything. I remember just going live, I think it was on maybe just on Facebook at the time, and just saying, like, you guys are probably hearing this, coming from Israel, but this is an kept using the word unprecedented attack, unprecedented, rockets here, rockets there, continued in Jerusalem. The scope of what was happening didn't become clear for several days, and you honestly didn't know what to do. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and we're in Jerusalem, sirens stopped after a while, and my kids, they wanted to go out and play. I'm reading these news updates, and I'm like, "You're not leaving the house." We started to understand, for all I know, somebody jumped in a car and continued driving to Jerusalem, and who would have stopped them? And so these were the things we were thinking about. And of course, then, the holiday extended. It was like the holiday that never ended. The Sukkot didn't end. It just continued for another 2 weeks of no school and just having no routine, just being like, we have just transitioned into a bizarre new world.
So I just want to clarify for people that you were being sarcastic when you said rockets for the holiday, right? Meaning that it's not so uncommon for rockets to come from Gaza. I don't know if it's
Mhm.
also true from the north. This is something that happened.
Yeah, and because it's sporadic rocket fire, it had been for years. Between, like, wars, you get this sporadic rocket fire, and they usually don't even cause damage, thank God, right? Thank God for the Iron Dome and everything, so usually it doesn't cause damage. So it was a holiday, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess they're, just saying, like, 'Hey, let's shoot a few rockets because we know it's a holiday.'" I mean, look at Yom Kippur, of course, another holiday, but,
A holy day.
a holy day to break up to kind of ruin it, to defile the holy day. So that's what I originally thought that was just to say, let's ruin their holiday.
Right. And the Yom Kippur War had been 50 years prior, right?
Unbelievable. Yeah, to me, that was just unbelievable.
You were scared. You're describing that you were scared for yourself, for your children. Did you ask yourself, why am I here? I could leave. I could go to America. I could get out of here.
No, I was actually asking myself, who can I work for, as a freelancer? How can I get down south? I didn't think about leaving, actually. I just thought, this is why I'm here. When I looked back, actually, so many people left for months. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, I didn't even think of that as an option. And by the way, I do feel really safe in Jerusalem. It's not usually the safe place. Like, it's so funny. People from Haifa will say, like, how do you live in Jerusalem? And I'm like, it's great. It's safe. I don't know. It's safer than New York. So I was concerned, but never to the point of leaving.
What about your husband?
Well, for him, this is where he lives and this is home. He less thinks of leaving than I do. And, for him, it's not an option. He's not an American citizen. It's interesting, actually. Also, like a lot of Palestinians feel the same way. Palestinian Israelis, that live in Israel and have only an Israeli passport. They also can't leave. I guess it's a privilege of being an American or having another passport that I do have that option. But neither of us at the time thought about it.
For your husband, who's lived here all his life, how did he start to metabolize this war as different than others?
Well, first of all, the scope of the war is like nothing, even though he lived through 2 intifadas and he also actually lived through when Iraq fired
The Gulf War.
the Gulf War, thank you, walked around with gas masks and everything. So, but for everybody, I think the scope of this war is just like nothing he's ever seen. Like I said, we still feel really safe living in Jerusalem. It's very far from the south where they lived on the Gaza border and then also in the north. So we have that buffer of safety, but understanding that that was a different kind of warfare and a different kind of attack than anything he had experienced. Because when it was the Gulf War, it was a foreign nation that was sending rockets. This is like your backyard. So it's definitely different.
Did you feel that October 7th had an impact on your faith?
In what way?
Well, for some people, living through it has made them believe in God in a stronger way. I've also heard from some people living through this that now they need to abandon the idea of God. There's no God in this situation. And I'm wondering if it affected your spirituality, your theology in any way.
Yeah, I prayed more. But no, it didn't. I mean, I've seen bad things, I've seen good things, and neither necessarily shakes my faith. Maybe it presses me to pray more, understand more, but no, it didn't shake my faith at all.
So let's talk about what you cover now. You're a freelancer.
Mhm.
I spoke to you at some point to try to arrange this interview, and you had recently been, I think, in the West Bank,
Mhm.
speaking with a Christian Arab woman. You can tell us about that story. It was difficult. And then I think you were going to a kibbutz where folks had been murdered and kidnapped maybe a day or two later.
Mhm.
The scope of the war is intense. I think the scope of your work now is also quite intense. What
Yeah.
can you share about that?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think you'd be interested, especially because of this series, is that a couple days after the war, I had an organization call me. It's a Christian a humanitarian organization. I know somebody who works there, and he said, are you available to travel to Eilat to interview some of the evacuees with our cameraman? And I was like, yes, definitely. And I went down there and I thought we were going to be fighting like the media, to get into these hotels and to talk to these survivors. And it turns out we were the only media there because, like, we were talking about the scope of the war unfolded in the first week. Like, you didn't know at the end of the first day exactly what happened. It took days. So I was down there already on October 12th. And we were meeting with this organization, actually paid for hotel rooms for some of the kibbutzim that they had worked with in the past. So we were there to interview them about their experiences. And it's interesting also, like you say, like therapists and journalists kind of have this first responder thing where we're there, where sometimes we're the first ones. And we were the first ones that these people were telling their stories to. They were still shaking, their voices, their hands. They were just, you could see them reliving it. There were a lot of tears. And now this was my first time doing something for this organization, and they're speaking on camera. And I didn't know professionally what we were supposed to get or what we were looking for, but it didn't matter. It was like you just had to let them talk. And, it would be like an hour long. Pretty much you would ask one question and they would talk for an hour. And I realized that what we were seeing was a form of therapy or catharsis, or I need to talk about this. And they were also still trying to understand their neighbors. Were they alive? Were they kidnapped? Why can't we find them? Where are they? There was so much uncertainty. So that was my first introduction to covering the October 7th war. And since then have also interviewed other survivors. Like you said, we were at the kibbutz. Even the other day, this man is talking, and you don't know the extent of what people are going through. And they speak very, Israelis especially, they're just very matter of fact. But there's a slight tremor in his voice, and it's like 11 months later. And it turns out he's talking about trying to rehabilitate the kibbutz and bring people back home. And then I'm like, okay, so well, what happened to you on October 7th? What's your story? And he tells his story, which was, he was safe, or crazily, he was riding a bike, and then he rushed back to the kibbutz when he heard what was happening, and he had to hide in one of the bomb shelters, like outdoor bomb shelters, but they never came near that one, and he was alone in there for hours, and, it's not much bigger than a bus stop that's completely encircled by cement. So, I mean, that's horrible, but he survived, his wife survived, and then he starts talking about his brother. Not only did he not know about his brother for months, about his fate, and he found out that the brother's wife, his sister-in-law, and another couple they were with were killed. They found their bodies. They never found the brother, so he didn't even know if he was kidnapped. And it was one of those cases where you hear months later, the army will say, "We've determined the death of so and so, based on this and that," or whatever, and you don't get details and you don't know. Well, finally, that became a person to me, because he said months later, long story, they found a bone and identified it through DNA that it was his brother. And the reason they never found the body is because they determined that a tank ran over his body. He was dead at the time, was probably shot, but the tank ran over his body. And it was so pressed into the ground and crushed that that's why he was never identified. And was like, my gosh, like there's no end to the stories. And I know people will say to me, "Oh, did you hear the story about so and so?" And I'm like, "No, I didn't." Like, I'm still so shocked with all the stories I've heard. There are still so many that are unheard, or they're heard by you, but not by me, by this person, but not by that person. And it's unbelievable. Also, a Nova survivor who lost her husband. I mean, I'm just like, when I interviewed her in February, she was still shaking, still crying. They'd only been married a month, her and her husband, and she's young and, can't work. You think of just the litany of issues that go with this, with the trauma. She can't drive herself around. She can't work a job, and your mind goes everywhere thinking like, what will be? Now, in the midst of all this, my work also brings me to minority communities. So, of all things, I'm with a Christian humanitarian organization meeting this woman who's Palestinian, whose son needed emergency surgery. And so the organization sponsored that surgery. And then we meet her in her home later to just do a follow up interview after the surgery. And she starts talking about, yeah, I have to leave at 5. There's a protest on the land where my in-laws used to live, but they were kicked out by settlers. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, I want to come see. I want to hear the story. And so that's the interview that you're referring to, where I got her side of the story to what happened. And sure enough, when we showed up, there are, Jewish settlers living on that land. They've put a fence up. There's another plot of land nearby. There's another settler behind that gate. And a settler, I don't know, like, is that, I try to pin people down when they say settlers, because I don't like to use that word as a euphemism, as a bad derogatory term for Israelis or for Jews. Sometimes I feel like it's used like that. So when I say settlers, I'm talking about the ones who do settle in specifically the West Bank and who want to also settle Gaza or resettle Gaza. I'm talking about them. And there are a specific movement. And so they were certainly there on this land. And of course, it's a, he said, she said situation where they say, no, this is our land. They literally did have a house and a restaurant, and it was destroyed by the army. and their belongings thrown out. So who really owns the land? Of course, it's going to be a legal issue. And they say, we have the paperwork. The Israeli Supreme Court actually said the Christian family, it is their land. But then an organization, I think it's associated with Karen Kayemet, with the Jewish National Fund, they have paperwork saying it's their land. So I have not gotten to the bottom of that. I just heard her story, which is that their belongings were kicked out, their house destroyed, their restaurant destroyed, and they live beyond the fence, which is now guarded by the army, along with armed settlers that live on the land. So
It's very hard to hear that things are not a monolith. It's
yeah.
very difficult, especially in a time of war when there's so much pain. I think that we can all agree that Hamas was monstrous. These are villains.
Yeah, no question.
Gaza is not the West Bank. The West Bank is not the North. We talked about this a little bit, and I was saying that I feel like in the diaspora, nobody is attentive to Jewish pain. And so I feel this real need to feel it, right?
Mm,
But here, it's a predominantly Jewish space, so of course people are attentive to Jewish pain. I think that's a good thing. But you are just splayed. I mean, you're just like segmented in this unbelievable way where you see villains and you see victims and you see survivorship across so many sectors of society. There are people in America who would say, look, if I knew Israeli settlers who had demolished land, I would forswear all my relationships with Israelis all across the world. Israel is a settler, colonizer, all this stuff.
yeah.
And you live here, so you have to understand that there are different cross sections within this society. Are you okay?
Oh my gosh. I know. After the episode, we should actually be, you're a therapist, right?
That's right. So we can transition.
No, you know what's interesting for me? I'm a very black and white person, and I need closure. I need the conclusion. Like, give me the conclusion of the matter. Who's right,
moved
who's
to
wrong?
the wrong region.
Totally.
Nicole.
And it broke me of my need to know, of my need to be sure. In fact, I feel like with my political beliefs, my religious beliefs, my opinions and my constructs, everything has been deconstructed since I moved here. And I think not a day goes by that I live in Jerusalem that I don't learn something new, whether it's about a people group or a political issue. Even my faith had to really be challenged. And ironically, as a minority, I feel like it's made me a stronger Christian being a minority. And because you got to know what you believe. I mean, you're surrounded by everything else. And so are you comfortable with being different? And so it's challenged everything, but it's made me be okay with not having closure. Like, it's made me okay with hearing, by the way, a couple months ago, or no, it was a year ago, so before October 7th, nothing like this has happened since October 7th, but I was in the West Bank on a settlement with an organization, I forgot the name, that was saying, like, we need to do this. Like, these poor people, they live here, the Jewish community that didn't have water and they're getting attacked and they can't even drive. The reason we had to build right here is because if they drive through this town, they're going to get shot at and they're going to get stones thrown at them. And
You're referring to Jews are going to
Jews are going to get.
Are not safe. Okay.
Yeah, Jews are not safe. Hence, we have to fortify the settlements and we need a very strong government, which now is in power, that is going to be pro-settlement and security in the West Bank for Jews.
And this is a Christian organization?
No. It was a Jewish organization. It was Jewish, that promotes settlement. So I was with them and you hear their side and you meet their people and the therapies they're doing. Like at this one center, this person, lost their brother and he lost his brother. So now he's dedicated his work to make sure that other children who lost siblings to terrorism, they get their therapy and stuff like that. And you're just like, oh my gosh, like that's horrible. And then you go and you meet the Palestinians who they say, we were living here and then we were kicked out and now they won't let us get to our farms. And if somebody gets too close, they get shot. And you hear these stories and it's like, wow, I just want it to be simple, like that one side's good and one side's bad. But That is, first of all, ridiculous. Secondly, it's part of the problem that I see right now. You're saying in the diaspora, like you feel a need to express Jewish pain and suffering, which is very legitimate, and you feel a need to express it because it's not getting attention. And I don't understand how we got to a world where we can't understand human pain and suffering, where it has to be either or, where it's so polarized. Whereas now I can see more that there are legitimate complaints on one side and legitimate suffering. And we have to be able to see on both sides what is happening and not be so polarized. And the most ironic thing is that I'm seeing it more after October 7th, when was unbelievable. And you would think, wow, everybody's going to be on Israel's side now. Like, I know Israel is always like, in the UN and or in Europe, like we're going to vote against Israel, whatever. And so I'm like, wow, after what just happened here, everybody's going to be on Israel's side. And lasted a couple days, and that was over. And then the protest movement and stuff. And I'm just like, what, guys? Can you differentiate between Gazans who are homeless and getting killed and suffering, and that are being forced to move from the north to the south, like a million people evacuate. The Israeli army says, evacuate Khan Yunis, we're going to bomb such and such. So 1 million people have to evacuate to Rafah. 1 million. That's a lot of people. And you think about, well, you know what? Many of them are innocent. Many of them are suffering. We should care just as much as we should not forget the suffering of the Israelis who are still going through their trauma and their grieving. And there's still 101 hostages as we speak.
Right. I feel that I've been put into an inhumane position to think about death in the way that I have started to after October 7th, meaning that I'll think, well, of course they bombed that school. There are Hamas operatives there. There are weapons there. I have never had a military consciousness. I've never thought about just war. I have the privilege of living in the West. And now, right, I think all of us are thinking and feeling in ways that are really unfamiliar to our generation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to say. Like, that's one of the things that I'm talking about, that I'm like, yeah, please don't bomb a school or a church. But Hamas is definitely using places like that and has been. But how do you do it? Like, I'm not a military strategist. I don't know what the right answer is. Like, there's only 1,000 Christians in Gaza. So, I mean, talk about minority. Like, they get the prize for, the Christian minorities here in the Holy Land. 1,000 out of 2.2 million people are Christian. And so, I hear a lot from them. I interviewed a pastor of a church. He used to live in Gaza. He now lives in the US, but he's still in touch with them, and he still has an organization that he's getting aid to people in Gaza. I interviewed him a while ago, and he's like, we have to understand also, like, these Christians are hiding in a church. They think the church is their safe place. And then somebody, a woman, got shot outside the church, going to the church, like a church compound. And then her daughter went to help or whatever and also got shot. And so his point is, these are two women. Were they Hamas combatants? Why were they shot? And it's like the same time. So if you're like with Israel, you're going to say, well, we don't know. We don't know the circumstances. Maybe they had a suicide belt. Maybe this and that. But for the Christian who's sitting there, he's saying, like, there's two women that go to my church. I know them. They're not Hamas. So I find that this is just one of the most mind-blowing things, because should there be a way to secure your country? Of course. How it's done, I mean, I'm the last person to tell you, because I'm not a military strategist. I don't know. I have no military experience. But these are the questions that are coming up. And I believe it's okay to ask them. I mean, if you're asking them and saying your conclusion, that's fine. But we should ask them. We should say, like, okay, this is happening. Is it okay? What do you think? Actually, why can't we just talk about it?
I think I told you prior to our conversation, maybe I did. Maybe I didn't, that I knew that this conversation was going to be uncomfortable for me.
Oh, is it?
It's okay. It's okay, because I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely right. It's important to ask the question. And what has been really frightening is that people aren't asking questions. People who have the privilege of being outside of these zones should be the ones who are the standard bearers for really putting consideration into this. And instead, it feels like these are the people who have become the most polarized. So it is difficult. It is difficult to hear that women are being shot. It is difficult to hear others who are soldiers say, well, one time somebody came out with a gun and, there was like a burqa and it was,
Yeah.
because these are also friends of mine. But you, again, we met at this party. Maybe you were the only non-Jew there. Have you been able to ask these questions publicly with your Jewish friends who are feeling a level of pain and possibly anger that might prevent you from having these conversations right now? Do you find yourself able to have this kind of nuanced conversation with people who are feeling angry, Jewish people who are feeling angry and afraid?
Probably not. I think I try to read the room. And then also if I'm like as a reporter, I can feel free to ask the questions, but I also can be sensitive to a situation and understand where people are coming from. Now, in terms of actually having debates with people who are in pain or trauma, I just don't do that.
I have another question. Are your children going to draft into the IDF? Do you have any idea about that?
It's a great question. They probably will have to. Like, that'll probably be, they will get called up. I've heard even cases of residents who are Christian living here from America, not like even the indigenous Christians, but they're not even citizens. One of them was actually happy to draft. And then later on, they were trying to, get their kids out. And nope, they had to draft. They had no legal recourse. So I don't know legally what my kids should do. And it's just really an interesting question now because, my kids' identity issues, I don't know what I've done to them. And I just pray that God will help them someday figure out their identity. But they feel American. They say, we're American. I'm like, you've never lived in America, kids. You were born here, raised here. You have a
That's the one thing you're
passport,
not.
but you have never lived in America, And I don't know when it comes time, will they want to join the army? I don't know. Will they want to do national service, which is an option and actually touches our lives on a daily basis? Because I have a son with special needs and he goes to Shalva. Shalva is a center for children with disabilities. They have such amazing programs, and he goes to the after school program there. And it's basically staffed by girls doing their national service. And they're always amazing. They're amazing. We're still in touch years later.
Do these tend to be religious girls?
Almost always.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, they're probably living in the settlements in the West Bank too, which is like, so for me, again, covering this, I'm like, oh my gosh, but Naama might live there someday. She's like, right now she's with my Christian son. They're dancing at a bar mitzvah to a Haredi song at this party, which cracked me up. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I saw the guys there. And one guy, for sure, I saw him at one of the settlements. Does he know my kids are Christian and that they're dancing? Like, it's so funny. So these are the things I have to hold and balance and sustain and just look at like, oh my gosh. And sometimes I'm just shocked.
Do your children also identify as Israeli, as Armenian? Like, what are the layers of their
Yeah.
identities, or are they primarily American to themselves?
American, but Armenian, yeah. They are not, quote, as Armenian as the kids that are living in the Armenian Quarter and growing up there. And my kids don't speak the language. Hopefully they'll get that someday. But so they identify here as Armenian and they identify also as Christian. Now, as far as Israeli, I don't know if they know what that means. They are Israeli. They're growing up here. They're acting it. They know how to go to a store and not get cut off in line. That's
Well, that is an
Israeli.
incredible skill.
Exactly. And you need it to survive here.
Do they speak Hebrew?
Yeah.
They must.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So that's the other thing. The funny thing, oh my gosh, my poor kids. So in this school that has all the religions and everything, that when my son showed up to the Christian class, because they divided the kids into Jews, Muslims, Christians. So he went to the Christian class and all the kids in there were Arab. They looked at him and they're like, what are you doing here? He's like, I'm a Christian. They're like, no, you're not. Like, you can't be. And he's like, I'm more Christian than you guys are. And they're like, what? How can you be Christian? And because you're with the Hebrew speakers. And so for them, Hebrew speakers are Jews and Jews only. Also, my daughter, who's younger than my son, she thought, I always would correct her, like Arabic and Muslim was synonymous for her. By the way, it is for most Americans too, But I was like, but are they Muslim or Christian? And she's like, well, they're Arab. And I'm like, no, 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 but religion wise. And so I like, though, that they're learning it organically and not from a stereotype. And it was good for my son to go through that. And it was good for the other kids to go through that, of recognizing that my son, beating them in all the Bible study questions and quizzes and stuff like that, this Hebrew speaker who they have to translate everything into English for him because they're doing like biblical Arabic. And he's like, I can't read that. Like he's pretty good in Arabic, but he's not that good. It's like reading biblical Hebrew,
Right.
Yeah, so anyway, I think it was a good situation because it blows your preconceptions, maybe even before you have a chance to solidify them. And I do think that that's the advantage of, despite being raised with so many identities, it's also an advantage that they're raised with so many identities because hopefully they will have fewer preconceptions about other people.
That's really incredible.
I hope.
What are the narratives that they have about the war? They're in this school with Muslims, with Christians, with Jews. I don't know their ages. How do they understand the war?
My kids are all in fourth and fifth grade when the war broke out. So now a little older, but they hear the news, my poor kids. My daughter is traumatized from the news. She doesn't want me to watch the news. And I watch mostly the Israeli news, which I realize is also a narrative, whether it was before very left wing, anti-government, and now it's very like Israeli, but still anti-government, but pro-army. I don't know, whatever. So my kids are very exposed to the news. So for them, it was like, yeah, that October 7th, very bad. Can't believe it. They would go to school. There were different narratives going around. Now, I don't know what the teachers are saying, but there was definitely like, well, the Palestinian narrative is still a little bit like, not every Palestinian's condemned October 7th. So my kids hear those things. They have their own beliefs. I actually don't ask them and I don't force anything on them. I want them to develop some kind of critical thinking, which apparently has been out the window in the last couple years. So I don't force anything on them. So interesting about the school, though. I mean, this is crazy. So of course there's going to be two narratives, but there are not just narratives. There's actual real lives at this school, this particular one in Jerusalem. There was a soldier. He had just graduated from school a couple years ago. He was Jewish. He fought and was killed in Gaza. So the high school was dealing with that. And, there's Muslim teachers, there's every narrative out there. They have to deal with a student of theirs that was killed. There was also, there's a family associated with the school and actually a cousin of Hirsch Goldberg Polin at the school, at the high school. So from the beginning, you had this going on as well. So Israelis affected personally by the war in the school at the same time with the Palestinians at the school who have families in Gaza and are trying to balance, how do I get my relative out? What's happening? Are they going to be bombed every day? I actually have a friend who has 4 aunts living in Gaza City. And every day I'd be asking her, what's happening? What's going on? I mean, it's crazy. It's a small country. Like, you don't realize it. Like, it's so small that the people are intertwined. So the school has to deal with that. And after Hirsch was unfortunately killed,
Executed, yes.
executed, I went to the Shiva, not official Shiva, but the cousin's family held a Shiva meeting setting in their house. And at least 100 people from the school went. Muslims, Jews, Christians, all went to comfort this family. So while there are two different narratives or 20 different narratives always going around, there was still, in the midst of death and grief, there was unity and comfort. And, it really blows your mind. I don't think anybody left there with a different opinion politically, but there was love, there was comfort.
Shared humanity.
Yeah. And I was like, this is what needs to be. This is what we need to see more of.
Well, I hope that his family and his parents hear this part of the episode because his father said, may his memory be a blessing, but also for a revolution.
Mm.
And that's a revolutionary moment when all these disparate groups can come together to provide comfort in a state of grief. That's when we start to see something that could happen, right?
Yeah.
And I hope that they know that the seeds of the revolution were just in this ability to mutually comfort other mourners.
Amen to that.
Nicole, I really want to thank you for joining us. This has been a fascinating, difficult conversation. Your identity, your mere existence challenges many of us in good and growthful ways. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. And thank you.
פותח את ידיך ומשביע לכל חי רצון.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to What Came After wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at whatcameafter.com.
ומשביע לכל חי רצון, פותח את ידיך 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 ומשביע לכל חי רצון, פותח